Well, I was calling this. I've given this presentation before here, and I didn't have time to make a new one, so I'm just using this one. Although I did rearrange some of the slides. Um, Making money work for people and planet has always been kind of a theme that I kind of came out of the permaculture movement and back to the land movement and community and stuff like that from an intentional community in Tennessee here. And I came in, what's the problem going on here? We were trying to make a good demonstration of how to live, gracefully on less, but that didn't exactly take off for everybody. So I tried to figure out what else was going on. And along with all the monetary reformers and everything that I've discovered, we're talking, I think this series is called Masters of Money. And I think Silvio Gesell is one of those. And he wrote a book called The Natural Economic Order, um, published in 1919. And he was uh, a German-born citizen, and but uh, went to Argentina and worked in Argentina for a number of years, and was there during a big economic crisis. And he was, as it says here, an uncompromising critic of capitalism and institutionalized usury, um, which comprised the modern society and run things. And so while he was there, he uh, had some insights in watching shipping and that economy, and just studying. And some of his stuff, he talks about how Karl Marx and Proudhon were contemporaries, but that one was for the workers revolting, and the other one was for the how can I get rid of this thing at the bottom of my screen? It says stop sharing. Anyway, uh, workers revolt, or that the workers change the economic mechanism. And so he was saying that Proudhon didn't what came closer to figuring it out, what the root problem is, but not quite, but much closer than Karl Marx. Um, in the natural economic order, it breaks it down into distribution, free land, which land being an important component to economics, obviously. Money as it is, where big section they're talking about what's going on, and then free money, or as money as it should be. And so that's where his proposals are. And then there's the free money theory of interest. He was he supported free trade and free love, and identified two roles of money. One being the exchange medium for facilitating economic activity, and the other an instrument of power capable of dominating the market, the hidden hand. And of course, that's accumulated money gives it power to do that. And so his investigations began with the question, how can money's characteristics as a usurious instrument of power be overcome without eliminating its positive qualities as a neutral medium of exchange? And by a usurious instrument of power, I thought I'd mention the Princeton study showed that the public had no influence on public policy in the US, and that they did two studies, a 10-year and a 5-year, uh, looking at different things. And so at the 10-year, they looked at spending of of various segments of industry. And of course, finance, you see, was the biggest. And and of course, if you think about it, pharmaceutical, energy, defense, communications, those are all profit centers for finance, you know. So they're all in debt to finance. Right? That's all part of that money system. And and collectively, they spent $5.8 billion influencing the government. And this is the 200 most politically active companies is what they were looking at. And but what they got back was $4.4 trillion in taxpayer subsidies and support, which was like a 700 or 678% return on investment. So um, the big banks and the people behind the banks, we should say, um, have known for a long time that government is a very profitable investment. And so that began a very long time ago in Europe, right? Because the word for capitalism came from a French word, capitalisme, which meant borrowing large amounts for war. And so it was war debt that uh, got those countries turning over their monetary authority to the banks. And of course, operating out of Amsterdam, they funded the uh, transition of England, I guess you might say, into their system. And but anyway, history, yes, I love history, and I hope you do too, because that's as Galbraith said, that's you can't understand what's going on unless you know the history. One of the important things that Gesell wanted to note in order to um, disempower uh, money as a usurious instrument, you know, against the many, was that the money shouldn't be a store of value that didn't rot like all the things you buy with it, or the most important things you buy with it, you know, like your newspapers and your potato, your food, and you know, your equipment that you buy is made out of metal and it eventually rusts and degrades, and you know, everything we get just entropy, but there's no entropy in money. It keeps increasing. And so that was a problem. And so he solved it uh, with a demurrage fee so that the money would degrade just like everything you buy, so that production and money were kind of matched in that sense. So, uh, so he says, we must make money worse as a commodity if we want to make it better as a medium of exchange. And Maynard Keynes uh, was impressed by Gesell too. And there's a famous quote in chapter 23 there where I can't remember what it is and I can't see it because oh, there it is. I believe that the future will learn more from the spirit of Gesell than that of Marx. Um, and yeah, I think that's right, but I think it's also still in the future. And Irving Fisher too. In fact, I believe he sent an agent over there to investigate what Gesell's work being demonstrated had done. Um, and he also praised Gesell as he said, I am a humble servant of the merchant Gesell. And so, yes, Gesell was the merchant economist, you might say. Uh, I've heard him referred to. And Fisher was impressed with the, and why was he impressed? Why was Keynes impressed? Had they read his book? Maybe. I doubt it. But they might have read it. But I doubt if that's why they were praising him initially. I think it was because his ideas were demonstrated here in Wörgl, Austria. And Wörgl, Austria in 1932 was in the depths of the Depression. It was only about 4,000 people. They had like 30% unemployment. The factory was shut down. The the streets were full of unemployed, and they had a bunch of homeless families in that town, and quite a bit of hunger, as you might imagine, even though they're a pretty agricultural area. And so, yeah, things weren't real good in Wörgl. But there was this train engineer named Michael Unter Guggenberger, and he was a train driver, but he had been reading Gesell's Natural Economic Order and was digging it. And so his town was in economic depression, and he went to the town council and he said, why don't we try this money system? Why don't we uh, and they didn't know what he was talking about. And so he told that story about the $100 bill. Uh, if you've never heard it, it's a Depression era story, I think, where uh, a guy drives into this town that's depressed, kind of like Wörgl was, where nobody had any work and nobody had any money. And he goes into the hotel, slaps down $100 bill, and says, "I want to look at a room I might like to spend the night." And so the hotel clerk says, "Well, the best room's up at the top. That's the suite up there. And you're welcome to go check it out." And so the guy heads up the stairs, and the clerk takes that $100 bill and he runs to the carpenter and pays his bill at the carpenter for doing some work on the hotel. The carpenter takes it to the grocer to pay for his grocery bill he owed the grocer for. The grocer runs to the butcher that he owed money to the butcher for, and the butcher, he runs to the prostitute who he paid to visit and owed money to. And then the prostitute took that $100 bill to the hotel to pay for the room that she'd been using there. And just as she put the $100 bill back on the counter, the guy came back down the stairs, picked up his $100 bill, and said, "No, I don't think I will spend the night. Thank you," and left. And then the town council, they kind of look around at each other and think, "Whoa, what?" So, yeah, let's issue our own money and see what happens. And they said, "Well, okay, but you have to be the mayor and you have to be responsible for all this in case it goes wrong." Right? So they made him the mayor, and he started issuing this money. And they initially issued 4,000. Well, I'm not going to use shillings. I'll say they issued about $4,000 worth of currency and initially, and later issued 2,000 more. Um, and it with the demurrage fee, it circulated very fast. And so they spent it out into the economy on public projects, right? So they paved their roads, they put in street lights, they extended the water system out to everybody. They built homes for all those homeless families. Um, they built a new bridge to improve the commerce across the bridge, etc. Um, and numerous other things. They had a food kitchen. They reopened the factory. Did all of these things. They did $2.5 million worth of public projects accomplished in 15 months while they were allowed to use this currency. And Of course, it was made illegal by the central bank when they discovered it. But let's keep going there on this story first. So they built all this stuff, and they started thinking long term instead of short term, which is kind of an effect of a demurrage currency. And they started thinking long term, so they started planting trees. They built a much larger water reservoir. And they built a ski jump, thinking about attracting people after the, times are better to come and do skiing and all of that, bring some tourist dollars to town. And and so they started thinking about the future and investing into the future in that short amount of time. That kind of change happened, which I I just think it's astonishing. And so, welcome to Wörgl in 1933. And of course, they didn't have automobiles or anything, but it was so prosperous that people from all over the world came there to witness what was being called the miracle of Wörgl. And the president of France sent an agent there to interview the mayor about the system. Uh, and as I said, Irving Fisher sent somebody over there, and so it was wow. And other towns wanted to duplicate it. In fact, they did in Austria. There was a number of other towns. It started spreading. People started using this kind of a currency system, and of course, that alarmed the elites. But the miracle of the Wörgl had spread all over the world, and cities and municipalities and towns all over the world were wanting to try it and were trying it, but a lot of them didn't know what they were doing. And so Irving Fisher wrote a book called Stamp Script, and, and, and which had a chapter in it called a manual for, I think, municipalities. Let's see what it say. It said Stamp Script Manual for Localities. So right here, it would tell you how to do that system. And this was all its history and how it worked and all that kind of stuff. So he was a real big fan of it and tried to get FDR to use it as an emergency measure because he thought, we could get out of the depression in just a few weeks if we did this. And he was turned down. But that book, this is online. It's available online. You can just do a search for Irving Fisher's Stamp Script book. And so, towns tried all kinds of things in currency, not quite knowing what, but trying to duplicate what was going on, but they didn't quite get the stamp thing and didn't quite understand demurrage. And they wanted the money to always be a store of value, right? It was hard to get people to let go of that concept. But towns started issuing their own currencies. And here's Tenino resident posing with wooden currency. It was a thin wafer of wood that was printed for currency. And in fact, during the COVID-19 lockdown, Tenino started issuing those wooden dollars again to spend to help the local businesses stay alive. And Bernard Latour pointed out that demurrage system has very long history because it goes back to because in Egypt, and he said like 3,000 years of prosperity in Egypt was due to a monetary system that they had that was a demurrage monetary system. And how it worked was people would take their grain to the silos there, and they were given a straka with the date and amount on it. And that, they say there's no evidence that this was used as a circulation medium. Uh, I read later, but Bernard says when you see villages with 1.5 million of them excavated in archaeology, it's pretty obvious they were using it for money and it was circulating. And of course, it would lose its value to the point where you didn't need it anymore. And it didn't always go right back to the granary, but that's what it was used for, of course, to get its value, to go back and get your grain so you could plant your field with wheat again. And you could, you would bring 10 bags and they would give you this receipt, but you could only come back and get 9 bags or less, or maybe it's 1 bag and they take 9. I'm not sure that would be how that worked, but it worked very well for them for a long time before, um, you know, greed started setting in, apparently, pharaohs and stuff like that. Um, it also occurred again in the High Middle Ages, where during that time, uh, the lords, all those different monarchies and kingdoms around, would, and of course, they traded amongst themselves with gold stuff, valuable metals. But each of those kingdoms would issue money for the people to circulate, just so that they had a circulation medium for their economy, for the so that the bakers and the farmers and the butchers and everybody could do their business. And then they would tax it every year. So it functioned kind of like a demurrage currency again. Well, another aspect of kind of a spiritual aspect was that in doing that, uh, it 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 empowered women. That women uh, were given more freedom in those societies during that period, and they became the head of abbeys and stuff like that. Uh, and this is partly because the object of worship was the Sacred Mother, and the Black Madonna around that time was an icon, a religious icon representing the Sacred Mother, who was the birth mother of the world. And but during that time, the first universities were founded, hydro manufacturing and farming boomed, and 1,000. That's when the great cathedrals were all built during those 250 years, and along with about 300,000 churches too. So it was quite a thing. But they would build these cathedrals, a small village, build a huge cathedral that would seat 3 times as many people as there were in town. And that's because they were thinking of the future. They were operating on long-term thinking because that system had brought them to that early on. And so they were thinking long-term. And so those cathedrals and stuff were built by the people. They weren't built by the kingdoms, by the kings. They did it. The people did it with their own money and resources. And of course, they were being taxed, but and also I imagine getting their kids drafted off to the crusades and stuff. And eventually, the kingdoms all got in such debt they had to end this system, and because they were in debt for the wars, and then the people had no money. Depression set in. Pretty soon, they lived in such squalor that the plague was able to happen. While the population had more than doubled during that period, it went back down about half again to in the during the plague. And so I believe that's about how much. I've heard some conflicting numbers on all that, but somewhere, a lot of people. And that thing about long-term thinking comes from, I just happened to find this one time. No, Bernard Latick pointed out that the dynamics of net present value, which is a formula uh, like this. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so that totally agreed to me. And but he explained it this way: that say this is the physical reality that uh, you plant some pine trees and in 10 years they're worth $100, or you plant an oak tree and in 100 years it's worth $1,000 as the base. Said, well, now if you issue a currency into that economy at 5% interest, those pine trees in 10 years would not be $100, they would be 61.39. And the oak tree in 100 years would only be $7.60. So the value of things going down over time. Whereas with a demurrage fee in 10 years, instead of 100, it's 167. And the oak tree in 100 years, instead of just $7.60, it's $168,000. So that changed. Now, nobody was doing that calculation in their head, obviously. It was an effect, a psychological effect of that money system that caused them to start thinking long term because things were more valuable in the future in that system. And so I mentioned psychology, the effects that money has on psychology, and there's quite a lot of them. This is one of the quotes from Claire Mitchell says, economics without input from psychology is similar to doing mechanics while ignoring the law of physics. But it's also, as we talked about, being a usurious instrument of power. Margaret Thatcher had this chilling quote, I thought, was economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. And so it's, something deeper here going on, and it has to do with the money. And so we need to change that because that usurious instrument of power is really making a mess of things, right? But is one of my favorite papers was Kathleen Doss and Company's paper on the psychological consequences of money. And of course, as most people, they were just accepting money is not it's just money. It's not, there's no different kinds of money. It's just the money, right? But they were looking at current money system. And so it was usury money issued as debt, and issuing money as debt for profit. That's the definition of usury, the abuse of monetary authority, personal gain. But what that her study, they did a whole bunch of different tests, but one of them that I thought was very remarkable was they had two classrooms. And in one classroom, they had a big picture of a dollar bill on it. And in the other classroom, they had a big picture of a seashell, I think maybe a cowrie shell up on the wall. And then they had students come in to each of those classrooms, and they had a kind of a test that had a lot of ambiguous questions, it was just, a nothing quiz kind of thing. And then they just observed those groups in those two classrooms to see what kind of an effect those pictures on the wall might have had. What they discovered was that the room with the dollar bill on it, the people stayed in the rows that the desks were set up in. They chose seats as far from each other as they could. Uh, when asked for help, they were not helpful and often kind of rough. Um, they had most of them they just put their head down trying to do the quiz, and then they went and looked at the other room, and in the other room the people had moved the desks around into a circle and were talking about the test and laughing about it and kind of taking it together. And I'm thinking, there's your psychological consequences of money. We can reverse the psychological consequences by changing the money from a system where money's issued for personal gain to a public system where money's issued for public care, for public purpose projects, doing the things that we, the people, everybody needs for the common good. And so what they discovered in these tests was that the mere presence of money changes people. It can be a barrier to social intimacy. And of course, we have an epidemic of loneliness, a lot of alienation, and a lot of criminal behavior, unethical behavior. All of these things are psychological effects that they discovered of money. And now that's not the only, there's a bunch of tests out there that they did. And I told you about it. Here's the list of things I was trying to show that what they were doing there in that story I just told. But usury is, like I said, the abuse. Dante put the users in the lowest subcircle of hell and called it an anti-art because it produced nothing substantial of value. And one of the scholars that on Dante had this quote, which I thought fit in. He said that usury was an extraordinarily efficient form of violence by which you do the most damage with the least effort. And of course, we're huge damage going on. Change of public money would reverse the system. Together, the results of these studies demonstrate that mere exposure to money can trigger unethical intentions and behavior and is a barrier to social intimacy. I'm repeating myself, but I guess that helps get it across. Here's a quote from E.C. Wörgl. I don't know if you've ever heard him. He was a monetary reformer, I think, back in the 30s or something. But he said, political democracy go no further in freeing man until it itself is emancipated by economic democracy, whose sheathed sword is money. So recognizing that money is how we can get out of this. And of course, the Greeks, Sadi points out, like 2,000 years before Christ, that recognized that the most vital prerogative to democratic self-governance was to issue the money. And that has been the battle, I think, the central political issue for this entire civilization. And, once in a while, some public money emerges, and but it gets squashed or whatever. It doesn't last too long. 250 years, that was pretty good. Pretty good run. 3,000 years for the Egyptians, that was pretty good. But the greenbacks, they had a hard time staying alive because of the economic oppression of the banks and who controlled every industry. I always find it remarkable that there was this investigation. People don't talk about it. I never heard of it, but the Pujo investigation of 1912 exposed the fact that the banks controlled every industry in the country, and with J.P. Morgan at the very center of all of those banks, and that's not changed. That's not changed. We got to remember, we got to go back in history. You can't just start history wherever you want. Like Ukraine war started in 2014, but if you talk to most of the media and most people, they think it started just when Russia invaded Ukraine. And it's you got to know the history. And another quote I thought that fit good with this was that in terms of a leverage point, because money being a leverage point, a leverage point is a point within a complex system, such as a corporation, economy, your body, ecosystem, whatever, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. So, I would say reversing the psychology, making it possible to fund human need, those are big changes. Changes that would be awfully good for humankind all around, I think. Um, and I'll just finish up with a quote from Bernard, who said that since the dawn of times, monetary systems have been shaping the flows of human activity in every realm of endeavor, food production, education, health, business, etc. By determining how we value, apply, and exchange our creativity, the fruits of our labor. It is for this reason the most influential system that humans have ever made. Um, and so, because it's so influential, it has to be a public system, right? If it's a private system, we're in trouble. Well, it is a private system, so we are in trouble.